It was already night when the phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the silence of the house, making Mariana jump off the couch, a chill running down her spine. She glanced at the wall clock, 10:30 p.m. It was late, but she was used to it. As a supermarket attendant, the night shift was almost routine, though it was always a bit lonely. But tonight, there was something different in the air. She picked up the phone with a strange feeling, almost as if the device was vibrating in her hands. The voice on the other end was muffled, hesitant. "Mariana? It's the supervisor from the store. Could you cover the night shift? We're shorthanded for closing time." Mariana furrowed her brow. The supermarket where she worked had been closed for a few days for renovation, but there was always an occasional shift, and the place didn't seem that busy. She hesitated for a moment, trying to see through the fog of exhaustion that surrounded her. "Sure, but you know the store is closed, right?" Yeah, but we need someone to organize a few things." "Don't worry, it won't take long. Just until 6 in the morning." There was something strange in the supervisor's voice, like he was trying to hide something, but Mariana couldn't figure out what. Or maybe she was just too tired to think. She accepted the job and hung up the phone. As she stood up to grab her jacket, she felt an odd sense of unease, but she brushed it off. It was nothing a good cup of coffee couldn't fix. She tried to focus on the work. She spent the rest of the night arranging some shelves and organizing items that had been scattered on the floor. But as time passed, the feeling of discomfort grew. Something was very wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the fact that she was so alone, or the bizarre environment that seemed to have a life of its own. What really bothered her was the absolute silence. The supermarket seemed suspended in time, with no trace of life. While rearranging some boxes on the shelf, a sound from the far end of the aisle made her stop. It was as if something had moved, a muffled sound, something that shouldn't be there. Mariana hesitated, listening to the darkness. She knew she should go and check, but fear paralyzed her for a moment. The supermarket was empty. There was no one else but her. But why that sound? And why did the place feel like it was changing? Fear was palpable, like a cloud forming over her head. But Mariana did what anyone would do in her situation. She ignored it. She turned her back and kept working, trying to stay calm. But the sound didn't stop. She walked down the aisle, each step echoing strangely, as if the concrete floors were warping under her feet. The air felt thicker, as if something was suffocating the place. When she reached the end of the aisle, there was nothing there. No source for the sound. Nothing that could explain the noise. However, as she turned to head back, she saw something that made her freeze. One of the shelves had moved. Mariana blinked. She looked again. The shelf was completely different from how she had left it. There were more products on it, things she didn't remember seeing before, and the feeling that the walls were somehow closer only intensified. She felt the blood freeze in her veins. The supermarket was changing, or was she going crazy? Mariana hesitated for a moment, trying to convince herself that she was just imagining things. Maybe the exhaustion was finally starting to affect her. She couldn't be seeing what she thought she was seeing, but the feeling of discomfort that washed over her was undeniable. She took another step back, not taking her eyes off the shelf, as if afraid it would disappear before her eyes. But it didn't disappear. On the contrary, the shelf was becoming more and more crowded with products that didn't belong in that aisle. Craft beers, cans of soup she didn't recognize, and something even stranger, glass jars with labels that seemed to have been handwritten, with words in a language she couldn't understand. Mariana felt a growing weight in her mind, something that made her question her sanity. She had always known that working the night shift in an empty supermarket could be boring, but this was something else. She quickly turned around, intending to walk away from the strange aisle and head back to the front of the store. But to her surprise, the lights began to flicker one by one, as if an invisible force were playing with the environment. The sound of the flickering lights filled the air, a mixture of crackling and buzzing that seemed to come from every corner. Each sound amplified the tension, as if the supermarket itself were breathing. The aisle to her left seemed darker now, and when she looked to the right, she noticed something even more disturbing. The walls, which had been there before, now appeared distorted, as if they were stretching toward a distant, unreachable point. Mariana took a step back. The supermarket was transforming before her eyes. It was no longer the same place she had entered just moments ago. The feeling of being watched intensified with every movement she made, as if something or someone was waiting for her somewhere in the shadows. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "It's nothing," she thought. "It's just my imagination." But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The silence now seemed deafening. The place was empty. There was no more sound of flickering lights, nor the soft hum of fans. Only the sound of Mariana's footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. She quickly stepped away from the area where the shelves had moved, seeking refuge at the back of the supermarket, where the stockroom should be. Maybe there she could focus on her work, ignoring the strange feelings that unsettled her. But as she passed through the back door, something caught her attention. There was something different about the shelves in the stockroom. Products she didn't remember seeing. Bags of flour with faded labels, cleaning product packaging from brands she had never heard of. And at the center of one of the shelves, an item that shouldn't have been there, a cereal box. The cereal looked old-fashioned with a torn, faded package, as if it had been there for years. The brand name was smudged and the image on the cover was blurry, but something about it seemed familiar. She cautiously approached and picked up the box. The moment her fingers touched the material, a cold sensation ran through her body, as if the box were emanating a strange presence. She slowly opened the box. Inside, there was no cereal, just a crumpled piece of paper, with words written in red ink, as if someone had hurriedly written them. The paper was dry, aged, and carried a chilling message. "Don't let the supermarket swallow you. Escape while you still can." Mariana felt her throat tighten. Fear took over her body, and she threw the box to the ground, as if it were the source of all the madness. She looked around, her eyes moving quickly across the shelves, but nothing else seemed out of place, except for the feeling that the space was getting smaller and smaller. Panic began to overwhelm her. She wanted to run, scream, ask for help, but something was stopping her from leaving. Something inside her, a voice whispering in her mind, telling her she had already crossed the line. She needed to get out, yes, but maybe it was already too late. The exit door was right in front of her. Mariana took a hesitant step toward it, but before she could reach the doorknob, the sound of something heavy being dragged behind her made her stop. She slowly turned around. An entire shelf, which had been empty before, was now moving on its own, as if it had a life of its own. It was dragging itself across the floor, away from the wall. And when the shelf aligned with the others, a single word appeared, grotesquely written on the boxes of products. Run. Fear spread, like a cold wave, through her body. Mariana could no longer ignore what was happening. Every part of the supermarket seemed alive, as if the very structure were aware of her presence, watching her with invisible eyes. She took a step back, still unable to believe what she was seeing. The shelf had moved on its own, and the word "run" was there, in distorted letters, made of products arranged in an orderly yet chaotic manner. A sense of helplessness took over Mariana. The supermarket, seemingly empty, was turning into something alien, something that shouldn't exist in this world. She looked at the exit door, which now seemed farther away than ever. An emptiness seemed to swallow each corridor, and the lights began to flicker again more intensely, as if they were about to go out for good. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, but didn't know where to go. She wanted to scream, but the feeling that no one would hear her was overwhelming. Mariana took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She knew she needed to think clearly. Maybe if she could find a way out, all of this would end. But when she turned to the corridor to her left, she saw something that made her freeze. From where she stood, she could see a silhouette, a tall figure, shrouded in shadows, moving slowly down the aisle. Her eyes fixed on the silhouette. Couldn't make out its shape clearly, but something about it was deeply unsettling. The figure seemed to approach, slowly and rhythmically, as if it had all the time in the world. The creature's steps were heavy, but made no sound. The feeling of being watched consumed her. She couldn't stay there. She needed to get out. Without thinking, Mariana started walking quickly toward the exit, but before she could reach the door, something strange happened. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as if the supermarket itself was preparing to swallow everything inside it. She turned once more, looking at the aisle leading to the checkout area. That's when she heard it. It was a low, muffled laugh, but clearly audible, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. It wasn't the laugh of a person, but rather something more strange, something that didn't belong in that place. Mariana stopped, her blood freezing in her veins. Her breath quickened, and panic took over. She didn't want to know what was there with her, but the laughter continued. It seemed to come from every direction, echoing off the walls, the ceiling, as if the supermarket itself were alive and mocking her. The light bulbs flickered again, and this time the crackling sound was so loud it made her ears ring. The lights went out, leaving the place in complete darkness. She no longer knew what was happening. Fear had completely taken over, and she felt like she had lost control of the situation. She pulled at the emergency door with all her strength, but it didn't budge. It was locked. The sound of the laughter intensified, now mixed with another noise, something heavy, as if being dragged along the floor. Mariana didn't know what to do, but instinct drove her to run to the back, toward the stockroom, where she could hide and try to understand what was going on. As she passed the shelves, she felt something cold and thick, almost sticky, brush against her skin. She looked at her hand and saw it was covered in a viscous substance, something like honey, but dark, almost black. She tried to wipe it off with her shirt, but the substance seemed to stick even more, as if it were glued to her skin. She looked around, desperate, and her eyes landed on a high shelf where something was moving, an object swaying slightly. Cautiously approaching, she reached out and grabbed what was there. It was a glass jar. Looking closer, she noticed the label was covered in a thin layer of dust, and when she wiped it away, she read the words written in red ink. "You shouldn't be here." Mariana let out a muffled scream, dropping the jar, but the feeling of panic intensified. The sticky substance, the sound of laughter, and the jar with the message. It was all suffocating her, as if the supermarket were trying to swallow her, devouring her slowly. She started running, aimlessly. Each step echoed off the walls, the sound of her own feet growing increasingly muffled, as if the supermarket itself were absorbing her movements. The walls seemed to be closing in, the air becoming heavier with each passing second. She needed to get out, but deep down, she knew that something much worse awaited her. Something inside that supermarket. Something that didn't want her to leave. Mariana felt the pressure build, the anguish becoming more suffocating. Each step felt harder, as if the floor were trying to trap her with every movement. The supermarket, in its entirety, seemed to fold in on her, as if it were an entity feeding on her fears, on her sense of helplessness. She ran through the aisles, without any clear direction. The sound of the laughter still echoed in her mind, distorted and grotesque, as if it were being amplified by the supermarket walls. She didn't know what it was, but she felt as though she were being followed. Something was there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The lights flickered frantically, turning off and on, creating an almost hallucinatory atmosphere. When the lights went out again, the darkness swallowed everything around Mariana. She stopped in the aisle, fear overtaking every cell of her body. She tried to breathe deeply, attempting to push away the feeling of claustrophobia that was spreading like wildfire inside her mind. When she opened her eyes, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The shelves, once arranged in a logical and orderly manner, were now crooked, as if they had been distorted by reality itself. Some items were scattered on the floor, but the strangest thing was what was on the nearest shelf. A porcelain doll, with a sinister smile, was there, staring at her with its empty eyes. Mariana felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at it. Suddenly, the doll began to sway slightly, as if it had a life of its own. The laughter, now quieter but still audible, came from somewhere behind her. She turned, but there was nothing there, only the silence of the empty store and the feeling of being watched. She quickly moved away from the doll, but couldn't help but look back. And it was in that moment that she saw, for the first time, something that made her freeze in place. At the end of the aisle, by one of the stockroom entrances, there was a door, but it wasn't a normal door. It seemed old and corroded, as if it had been left to rot in forgotten decay. But there was something more. The door was moving subtly, as if someone were trying to push it from the inside out. Mariana stood there, frozen, watching. Her mind screamed for her to run, but something inside her held her in place. What was that? What was behind that door? The door opened slowly, with a terrible creaking sound. Mariana could no longer move. Her feet were glued to the floor, as if the supermarket itself had paralyzed her. And then, from behind the door, something emerged. It was a hunched figure, with shoulders bent in a way that didn't seem natural. The creature's arms were far too long, and its hands, shaped into sharp claws, touched the floor as it crawled out of the door. Its eyes glowed in the dark, red as blood, and a thick mist emanated from its body, covering the corridor and distorting reality even further. Mariana couldn't look away. The creature was there, coming toward her. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, but her mind couldn't process what was happening anymore. The door was open now, and the creature, with its slow, calculated movements, advanced. With every step, it left behind a deep chill, as if death itself were crawling toward her. But before the creature could reach her, something strange happened. The supermarket began to tremble, as if waking from a long nightmare. The shelves shook violently, and the sound of light bulbs bursting and cracking filled the air. The figure quickly retreated, disappearing back into the darkness of the door. Stunned, Mariana tried to get up, but her legs were weak. She looked around, and the supermarket seemed to have returned to its original state. The shelves were organized, the aisles clean, the lights of the lamps softly illuminating the space. Everything seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. But the fear was still there, heavy in the air. She glanced at the stockroom door one last time, and this time it was completely shut. There was no sign of the creature or the distortion she had witnessed. Mariana felt the panic dissolve, but only for a moment. Something was wrong. She knew something much worse was lurking. The supermarket had changed, and she was only beginning to understand what was really going on there. The air was thick, saturated with the feeling that something wasn't right. Mariana stood up with difficulty, her body still trembling, while her eyes scanned the environment. The supermarket seemed harmless now, but she knew nothing would ever be normal again. The neatly organized shelves and softly lit lamps were more like a disguise than a relief. Fear was embedded in every corner, every reflection on the glass surfaces. She cautiously moved through the aisles, trying to ignore the distant sound of footsteps echoing deep in the store. The place was quiet, but the feeling of being watched never left her, as if the supermarket itself were alive, breathing, adapting to her fears and anxieties. She passed by the frozen food section, and her eyes fell on the display of an old ice cream box. Strangely, it was standing alone, as if it had been placed there on purpose. Mariana approached and picked up the box, slowly turning it to read the label. The product's name was familiar, but something was wrong with the design. The letters were distorted, and instead of product information, there were only scrawled words in red ink. "You're here." Mariana dropped the box immediately, terror overtaking her once more. It was then that she heard a sound behind her, as if someone were dragging something heavy on the floor. She quickly turned around, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. But there was no one there, only the same oppressive silence, the lights flickering erratically, almost as if they were trying to warn her about something. The stockroom door was there, unmoved, but as she looked at it, Mariana had the sensation that reality was beginning to distort again. The door seemed to stretch, grow, as if it were trying to expand and swallow the entire corridor. Her mind tried to fight against the rising vertigo, but the feeling that everything around her was collapsing took over. She took a step toward the door, and then her vision blurred, as if the world around her was being eaten away by something invisible. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to reorient herself. When she opened them again, she found herself in a completely different place. The store had vanished. In its place, an empty street stretched before her eyes, illuminated by dim lamps and covered by a thick fog that seemed to swallow everything around her. The sound of her footsteps echoed solitary, and she felt something was approaching. What was this? The supermarket, the door, the creature. It all seemed to have disappeared, as if it had been erased from reality. Mariana tried to walk, but her legs felt heavy, as if the very air had become dense and unreachable. The street ahead of her seemed endless, as if she were being swallowed by a tunnel of time. However, she was not alone. Voices began to echo through the fog, low and whispered, as if coming from all sides. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but she felt it was something important, something related to this place. She tried to run, but the street seemed to never end, and the sound of the voices grew louder. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the fog before her. It was a man, with his face covered by a dark hood, but something about his posture made her freeze. He approached slowly, his steps synchronized with the sound of the voices. The strange man stopped in front of her, and when he finally lifted his head, his eyes were not there. There were no eyes, only black holes that seemed to open wider and wider, as if they were trying to suck all the light around. The hole where the eyes should have been seemed to stretch toward Mariana's soul. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, unable to manifest. The man took a step toward her, and she felt an invisible force pulling her toward him, as if the very air were condensing around her body. "You knew that fear was just the beginning," his voice whispered, his mouth moving erratically, emotionless, as he approached. Mariana tried to fight, but her mind was shattering. The fragments of her own memories, reality, her very existence, blending into a fog of confusion. The street, the supermarket, the man, everything seemed to distort and collide into an incoherent mass, leaving her lost in the space between worlds. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the man smiling, his teeth gleaming like sharp blades in the darkness. She felt the weight of the darkness engulfing her, a sensation so overwhelming that she could no longer resist. And then silence. Mariana woke with a start, the warm, humid air filling her lungs. She was back in the supermarket, or at least, it seemed so. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, brighter now, as if they wanted to blind her with their intensity. The feeling of déjà vu surrounded her, but there was something else now, something different. The supermarket was darker, the aisles longer, and a smell of mold mixed with something indefinable hung in the air, as if the very environment were rotting from the inside out. She tried to stand, but her body felt heavy, as if it were made of concrete. The floor beneath her was cold, and her hands were sweaty, trembling. Her head still hummed with the sensation of loss and confusion, as if she were trapped in some kind of limbo between reality and something darker. She looked around, trying to understand where she was. There were no longer faces on the product shelves or bright ads calling her attention. The supermarket was empty but not silent. The sound of wind passing through cracks in the walls and the rustling of the shelves were the only noises she could hear. The feeling of being watched was back, as if something or someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment to act. She stood up with difficulty and headed toward the door she had seen earlier, at the end of the aisle. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, and each step she took felt heavier than the last. The door was there, but it wasn't the same, though it finished seemed more worn, as if it had been repeatedly torn off and put back on. But the worst part wasn't the door itself. It was what she felt behind it. Something horrible, like an intangible presence, pulling her back into that place. Mariana hesitated for a moment. Whatever was waiting on the other side of the door could be more terrifying than the supermarket itself. But she had no choice. Something inside her urged her to continue, as if destiny itself were forcing her to complete an endless cycle. Holding her breath, she opened the door. The scene that unfolded before her left her paralyzed. The corridor behind the door was no longer the supermarket. It wasn't even a physical place. It was emptiness, an infinite darkness, with shadows dancing around her. The door behind her slammed shut with a bang, locking her in. She was in the dark, surrounded by silhouettes that seemed to watch her without moving, but with a palpable sense of presence. With each passing moment, the shadows seemed to stretch, as if trying to reach her feet, her legs, pulling her down. She tried to run, but the floor seemed glued to her feet, making it impossible to take a step forward. As she looked around, the silhouettes began to move, distorted, formless, but with eyes. Eyes glowing in the darkness, fixed on her. Fear paralyzed her, but her mind, already on the edge of madness, tried to comprehend what was happening. The supermarket had disappeared. The place she was in now had no end, no reason, no logic. It was emptiness, and the feeling that she was being dragged into this void was uncontrollable. The silhouette started to approach, and a muffled sound began to fill the space, like a collective whisper. The words were unintelligible, but the tone of the voice seemed to summon her, as if something was calling her in a way she didn't want to understand. The tension was unbearable. She could feel her skin crawling, and her heart was beating uncontrollably in her chest, as if it wanted to escape her body. But suddenly, everything stopped. The sound, the movements of the shadows, everything. Absolute silence took the place of the chaos. A figure, larger and more distinct than the others, materialized before her. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was a dominant presence. Her feet were fixed to the ground, and her eyes were locked on the figure, as if there was no more room for escape. The figure raised a hand, and the moment its fingers extended, Mariana felt as though her soul was being ripped from her body. Panic enveloped her, but she couldn't move anymore. She was paralyzed, as if being pulled into an endless abyss. "You belong to this place now," the figure said, its voice echoing in her mind. Fear took over her. She knew that this was the end. The supermarket, the shadows, the voices, everything was part of an endless cycle. And now, she was a part of it too. The dark consumed her, swallowing her without leaving a trace. Fear became the only reality. The last thing she felt was the cold, insidious hand gripping her soul.